Welcome everyone to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course. Let's bow in. So tonight is a really, I feel, momentous occasion as we begin our study of one of the great classics of Tibetan Buddhist literature. The Kunzang Lame Shalom, it's called in Tibetan, which means the words of my perfect teacher, by the great 19th century Buddhist Patrul Rinpoche. I'm also going to recommend, if you wish, if you're energetic and have the time, to look at this book. It's called A Guide to the Words of My Perfect Teacher. It's by Khenpo Ngawang Pelzon, who went by other names as well. He was a later sort of disciple in the line, and it's quite terrific as an explanation for the words of my perfect teacher. I think if you study the words of my perfect teacher with a good spirit and hard work, it will reward you immensely. Change your life. I can feel the effect just studying it in preparation for this course. So, tonight we're going to go through some introductory material. First I and then Michael. He will do it. I'm hoping it's so dense. I've got pages and pages of notes here, more than usual. So we'll see how this goes. So one of the things that starts with this book is a foreword by the Dalai Lama. And he notes that Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu, his name was, Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu, was one of the eminent disciples of Jigme Lingpa. Jigme Lingpa is a very famous name in Tibetan Buddhism. Among the Nyingmas, probably the two most famous names are Longchenpa, who lived in the 14th century, and Jigme Lingpa, who lived in the 1800s, 19th century. Jigme Lingpa received teachings, terma, as it were, mind transmissions from Longchenpa. I once asked Trungpa Rinpoche, I've told this story, but I'll repeat it. I was sacrilegious, and I asked him if he could name the Babe Ruth of Tibetan Buddhism. And without pausing, he said Longchenpa. Longchenpa lived from about 1308 to 1369, had a relatively short life, and was utterly amazing, brilliant. Perhaps the most brilliant accomplishment was what were called the 7 treasuries that he wrote. And of them, one of them is called the Treasury of the Dharma Dhatu, the Treasury, the Tsuying Tsud, Chuying Tsud. Chuying means Dharma Dhatu, which means the space of reality, and Tsud means treasury. It's probably one of the most sublime texts in all of Tibetan Buddhism, describing reality. So, Longchenpa's teachings were communicated to Jigme Lingpa, who wrote received as a terma or a revealed text, a text called the Longchen Nyingtig. Longchen, long means expanse, Chen means great. So, and Nyingtig, Nying means heart, and Tig means essence. So it's the essence, the heart essence of the great expanse, the Longchen Nyingtig. And this was a body of teachings that was practiced, really, it's all about Dzogchen, the great perfection. And it was practiced by many, many, many Nyingma and others um, after the time of Jigme Lingpa. So, Jigme Lingpa gave this oral instruction on the Longchen Nyingtig to his disciple, Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu. And Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu became the teacher of Patrul Rinpoche. This is his main root guru, Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu. So you can see the lineage, Patrul Rinpoche to Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu to Jigme Lingpa. Patrul Rinpoche transcribed the teachings that he had gotten from Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu, and this oral instruction, Patrul Rinpoche was renowned for having an amazing memory. He could remember what he heard word for word, supposedly. Although this is how many hundred years ago now? A couple hundred. And he transcribed this, and this is the book that we are reading, The Words of My Perfect Teacher. This is the teachings of Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu, that as he received them from Longchenpa, the Great. As he received them from Jigme Lingpa, who got them from Longchenpa. So there's the lineage. Longchenpa, Jigme Lingpa, Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu, to Patrul Rinpoche, those four. My notes I'm just reading, this is what the Dalai Lama said. The Dalai Lama said, the Dzogpa Chenpo teachings, remember that Dzogpa Chenpo, Dzogpa means perfect. Chen means great. So this is the teachings of the great perfection. This is the penultimate teaching of the Nyingma school. It correlates among the Kagyus to the Mahamudra teachings. Trungpa Rinpoche taught both. And because Trungpa Rinpoche, while he was born a Kagyu, so he inherited the Mahamudra teachings, his root guru, Jamgon Kongtrul of Shechen, was Nyingma. And so he received the Nyingma teachings as well. And he taught both Dzogchen, the ultimate teaching of the Nyingma school, and Mahamudra. This, the Words of My Perfect Teacher, is really leading us into the Dzogchen path. Dzogchen teaches that one cannot become enlightened by means of a contrived mind. A contrived mind is one that you control, you think, you try and do things with. Rather, the basic mind is to be identified in relation to which all phenomena are to be understood as the sport of the mind, or sometimes it's called the play of the mind. And this is what when we start out our meditation in the mornings and we are resting in pure awareness, we breathe out and our awareness goes out with the breath and dissolves and becomes one with space. That is this, what does he call it? The basic mind, as opposed to contrived or thinking mind. And in this space of basic mind, which is something we all have, you can't shut it off. It's here now, every instant. It's what allows you to hear these words, see your computer screen, feel your bottom on the cushion now that I mention it, whatever may appear, that basic awareness. And in it arise the six knowables: sights, sounds, smells, tastes, bodily sensations, and mental events. These are what he means by the sport of the mind, often called the play of the mind. And this is the ultimate reality, this clear awareness in which all of these phenomena are playing, arising for our enjoyment, as it were. One then familiarizes oneself continuously and one pointedly with this understanding. However, to have a full understanding of this, it isn't sufficient merely to read books or listen to someone like me, say it. One needs the full preparatory practices of, in this case, the Nyingma system. The preparatory practices are the ordinary preparation and the special preparation, which we're going to come to. And you need the special teachings of a qualified Nyingma master, as well as his blessings. You're going to have to do with at second, third, fourth, fifth best, which is Michael and me. It would be wonderful if we had a real Nyingma master teaching this. The student must also have accumulated great merit, a lot of hard work. This is what produces great merit. And there are two kinds of merit. Well, there are the two accumulations which you have to have. Merit, which means doing good works, developing compassion, being kind, joyful, all of that, and wisdom. Wisdom and merit, these are the two accumulations that one must have on this path. So this work, the words of my perfect teacher, contains the Dzogchen preliminary practices. We're going to be discussing them. And it will be of immense value to those who wish to tread this path to enlightenment. And whether you're treading the Kagyu or the Nyingma path, these preliminaries are almost the same, as you will see. So it really doesn't matter. It's terrific, one way or the other. All of this applies to you whether you're Kagyu or Nyingma, and maybe whether you're Gelugpa or Sakya, which are the other two sects. The Dalai Lama subscribes to this wholeheartedly, and he's Gelugpa. So this work sets out the paths of the four main schools of Tibetan Buddhism without any conflict between them. Those are, as I just mentioned, the Gelugpa, the Dalai Lama's sect, the Sakya sect, which I personally have very little connection with, the Nyingma sect, and the Kagyu sect. It contains all the teachings, including A, the steps of the path for those of the three levels of understanding. The three levels of understanding are the Hinayana level, the Mahayana level, and the Vajrayana level. The Vajrayana being the ultimate level. It includes the three perceptions, which are the perceptions for the path and its fruit, meaning its goal, its what it produces. Buddha nature as the cause. This is what causes us to be able to tread the path. The fact that we all don't know it and don't see it clearly, but we are ultimately possessed of Buddha nature. It is our fundamental core essence. Tathagata Garbha, Buddha nature. We have the precious human life as a support. This life is so precious, it gives us the opportunity to tread the path. We have a spiritual friend as the impetus. In this case, it's Michael and I, and there can be many others more exalted. And the instructions as the method, the instructions of the spiritual friend. In this case, the real spiritual friend is going to be Patrul Rinpoche. And the kayas and wisdoms is the result. The kayas are what that is talking about is seeing this world through enlightened eyes as the three bodies of the Buddha. And the wisdoms, there are 5 main wisdoms, which we probably won't come to in this book, but we will at other times, the 5 Buddha families. And these representing the confluence of the Kadampa and Mahamudra traditions. Kadampa was a tradition that came to Tibet from India, and so did the Mahamudra tradition. Marpa the translator brought it, went to India and got it from Naropa and Tilopa, and brought it back and spread it in Tibet. And the Nyingma path in terms of determination through, this is what the Nyingma path is driven by. 1, disgust for samsara. This is something that we all need to pay attention to. We probably don't. We're so much looking for entertainment all the time. And we're just immersed in suffering of one kind or another. And it's very necessary to tread this path effectively, to develop disgust for this confusion that comes out of being unenlightened, being a confused sentient being. Faith through confidence in the effects of actions, that we begin to see that we can wake ourselves up and actually have the potential to be enlightened. Bodhicitta, as the awakened mind, through striving to help others, is so important on the path that we begin to develop the motivation to want to be of help to others and to feel the heart behind that and the enjoyment and the pleasure and the joy that it can bring to us as well as to those we help. And pure perception of the utter purity of everything there is. The utter purity, this is really the view of Dzogchen, that everything that exists in this world is fundamentally pure once we begin to see it beyond the machinations of ego mind, beyond the hopes and fears of ego mind, beyond the judgments, good and bad, of ego mind, to see this world as it is. It's utterly pure. And that purity is brilliant, illuminating, and inspiring. So this book covers all the essential points of the path, all practices, whether preliminary or main. And so it is indispensable. This, by the way, I'm reading now, is the foreword by Dugel Khyentse Rinpoche. Dugel Khyentse Rinpoche was a great teacher. He was a reincarnation of a great 19th century teacher named Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche. Dugel Khyentse Rinpoche died in 1990, I think it was. Maybe no, a little later. And was a great friend of Trungpa Rinpoche, who was one of his students, and came here. And I'll just tell you a story about Dugel Khyentse. I really didn't realize how extraordinarily great Dugel Khyentse was. He was probably the greatest teacher alive during his lifetime, especially towards the end of his life. The Dalai Lama and all other teachers revered him. He came to Boulder after Trungpa Rinpoche's death and gave teachings here, and then he went to Karme Chirling and gave teachings there, and then he went to Halifax and gave teachings there. When he was in Boulder, I had the great good fortune of being invited to have an interview with Dugel Khyentse Rinpoche. I and 4 other people. He was staying at what was used to be called Marpa House. It was a facility up on the hill in Boulder that we bought to house people who didn't have a lot of money, but also it had a suite for visiting teachers. And Dugel Khyentse Rinpoche was in that suite. And I went to that suite at the appointed time, and there were three other people. Yeah, 3 other people there. And each one of us had was given the opportunity to ask one question. I can't remember what the first 2 questions were. I was the third. And I asked Dugel Khyentse, who was sitting in this bed, and we're sitting on the floor, and the bed's raised up high. And as was his wont, I mean, Dugel Khyentse was a huge man. He was about 6'6" or 6'7", and probably weighed, upwards of 300 pounds. And mostly he sat in bed with Tibetan books. They're pages, they're called, which are pages, and turning the pages, reading, and writing with a pen and making notes while he was receiving people and listening to them and talking to them. And that was the case in this instance. He was sitting in this bed. When it got to me, I asked him my one question. My question went like this. I can't imagine living the rest of my life without Trungpa Rinpoche or someone like him in it. Should I go looking for another teacher? His response, no. You will never find another teacher like Trungpa Rinpoche, whom he loved. Now you have to find the Guru in your heart. That was the answer. For a long time, I didn't even go to hear other teachers, until finally For some reason, I went to hear Tsoknyi Rinpoche, who knocked me out. He was teaching nothing but what he called Rikpa. And it was the same thing I knew as what Trungpa Rinpoche called Tamal Geshepa, ordinary mind. And I actually went and had an interview with Tsoknyi Rinpoche and asked him, but that's another story. So, Dilgo Khyentse, great, great teacher. And this is what he is, what I've been reading to you here, what I've been telling you, is what he said about the words of my perfect teacher. There's so much more to say. Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche was the reincarnation of a great 19th century teacher named Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche. Jamyang Khyentse, Dilgo Khyentse. Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche was a legend. And in fact, I now study personally with a Nyingma teacher who is teaching us teachings that were received by Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche in the 1800s. And he was probably the greatest living teacher in his time. So all of these people were moving into the realm of really ethereal, advanced, wonderful, wonderful teachings given by great teachers. So, the Dalai Lama says, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche says, so the hope is that all contact with this book may be fruitful and that it may become the object of study, reflection, and meditation. It is of great importance that followers of the Dharma teach or study this text. And I hope you all get a chance to teach it, because that's the best way to learn. Here is the preface to the second edition. And this also includes, this second edition includes a postface, that means an afterword, at the end of the book, by Jamgon Kongtrul the Great, written for the very first woodblock printing in Tibetan a century ago. Jamgon Kongtrul the Great, Jamgon Kongtrul Lodro Taye. You see, in the 1900s, there were three great Nyingma teachers who were greater than really almost anybody who'd come before for hundreds of years. Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, who I already mentioned, Jamgon Kongtrul the Great, of whom Trungpa Rinpoche's guru was a reincarnation, Jamgon Kongtrul the Great, Jamgon Kongtrul Lodro Taye, and a third that we won't get into named Chogyur Lingpa. He was a real one-off character, that guy. To give you an idea, he was a great terton. That means he received and discovered hidden teachings that came from Padmasambhava. And Chogyur Lingpa was illiterate, couldn't read or write. Go figure how that happened. So I very much encourage you as you read this book to read not only the asterisks and sort of things at the bottom of each page. Some of them are useful, some of them are not. You know, you're not going to be interested in the Tibetan for these particular things. But I very much encourage you to read the footnotes, numbered, that appear at the end of the book. The numbers appear on the pages you're reading, and go to the end of the book. I keep a bookmark at the appropriate place in the numbered footnotes at the end. Some of them you won't be interested in. Many of them will deepen your understanding and add to the joy and the pleasure that you get from reading this text. So please take a look at those footnotes. So the translator's introduction, which is what my job is today. Michael, we'll see, this is very long, and we may have to do your thing on another day. We'll see if I can get through it fast enough. So, one of the best loved introductions to the foundations of Tibetan Buddhism, constantly recommended by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and other teachers. It's a detailed guidebook to the methods by which an ordinary person, voila, can transform his or her consciousness and set off on the path to Buddhahood, the state of awakening and freedom. We have this one precious life, all of us. We all have an enormous opportunity. I'm regretful that I'm approaching the end of my life. I'm 79 years old. Many of you are much younger. You have many more years in which to tread this path and achieve awakening, which is the ultimate, the thing most worth achieving in this life and accomplishing. The first half of the book consists of contemplations on the frustration and deep suffering of samsara, confusion, which is based on ignorance and deluded emotions, ignorance of the truth of life, ignorance of the truth of reality, and then the deluded emotions, hatred, anger, jealousy, passion, pride, and all the rest, which are such a source of suffering and egotism. It also, in this first half of the book, emphasizes the enormous value of human life, which provides the unique opportunity to attain Buddhahood, to wake up. We hardly know how immersed we are in ignorance and suffering, but we're going to discover. The second half of the book presents the first steps of the Vajrayana. Vajrayana means diamond vehicle. Vajra is indestructible, a weapon of Indra, and it represents indestructibility, and yana means vehicle. This is the Vajrayana, the Mantrayana, the Tantrayana. These powerful methods of transformation provide the distinctive character of Tibetan Buddhism. Powerful methods of transformation. This book is not a treatise for experts, but it's a manual of practical advice for anyone wishing to practice the Dharma. It's a manual that we can use. The style is accessible to rough nomads and villagers, as well as to lamas and monks. And it's full of humor, stories, anecdotes, and then divine teachings. Patrul Rinpoche says he was just setting down the oral instructions of his own teacher, Jigme Gyaltsen Nyugu, as he heard them. So he's just giving us Jigme Gyaltsen Nyugu's teachings. Reading it, we feel we are Patrul Rinpoche's own students listening to his heartfelt advice based on these oral instructions he received and on Patrul Rinpoche's deep experience of years of study and practice. By the way, I've said this a million times, but I'll say it again. If you want to have a lot of fun, read Mathieu Ricard's book, Enlightened Vagabond, about Patrul Rinpoche. And it's all these stories about Patrul Rinpoche. He was a one-off. What a character. Oh my God. He wandered the plains of Tibet dressed in rags. He was given tons of food, money, clothing, and he just left them behind. He gives us everything we need to know to practice the teachings, and also often with devastating irony, the many mistakes that can be made. And this is going to be a theme that comes up again, that one of the functions of a teacher is to point out to you your mistakes, your self-absorption, your egotism, your crimes. And in fact, one of the functions of the student is to confess these. But confessing is not like a Christian confessing. It's not an admission of guilt. Rather, it's a bringing to awareness of our neuroticism. Because unless we become aware of it, we can't do anything about it. So it contains many examples from daily life and a wealth of stories, some of which go back to the origins of Buddhism in the 6th century BC and beyond. Some are drawn from the lives of great masters, some from ordinary folk known to Patrul Rinpoche in his native Kham. Kham is an area of Tibet in the east, and it's also where Trungpa Rinpoche was from. And Patrul Rinpoche was from there. I've seen pictures of it. Most of it is at about 12,000 feet. That's where Trungpa Rinpoche's monastery was. And it's barren, very few trees, just mostly rolling plains, punctuated with the high Himalayan peaks rising up into the 20,000 foot plus range. So in the concluding chapter, Patrul Rinpoche says that his main aim, A, was not literary or aesthetic, but to faithfully record the oral instructions of his teacher in a way easy to understand and useful, leaving out his own words and ideas. And also, B, to show how his teacher on separate occasions gave numerous special instructions exposing hidden faults. This is one of the main functions of the teacher. I'll just repeat it. To expose the students' hidden faults, this self-absorption that we have, this self-pity, this self-loathing, the self-aggrandizement. He asks us to take these exposings of hidden faults as a mirror for examining our own faults, not others. And again, this isn't about Christian guilt. This is about awareness. To take them out of these faults, out of their hiding places, and correct one's mind and set it at ease on the right path. For Vajrayana Buddhism, enlightenment is not a remote ideal. Enlightenment is not remote, but something which, with appropriate methods and a supreme effort, can be achieved here and now in this very life. And there are people in this room who can do it. If you develop the resolve, and if not in this life, you can develop the inclination so that you're reborn, and in the next life you will tread the path again. One of the words for spiritual practice in Tibetan is Nyam Len, taking into experience. The lineage has been passed on, unbroken, from one realized teacher to the next until the present day. One realized teacher to the next. So, Patrul Rinpoche and the tradition he inherited. The Nyingma school is the oldest school of Tibetan Buddhism to which Patrul Rinpoche belonged. And in this school, I should say this, you know, that what happened was that Padmasambhava, Buddhism came to Tibet probably in the 7th century under a king named Sonsen Gampo. But it didn't really take hold until the 8th century under a king named Trisong Detsen, who became very inspired. And he invited a great teacher named Shantarakshita from India. Shantarakshita was a Mahayana teacher, not Vajrayana. And when he came, he encountered the forces of the native religions that were blocking the arrival of Buddhism. And so he went to King Trisong Detsen, who eventually became enlightened himself, and he said, look, I don't have the mojo to plant Buddhism here. There's too much resistance. There's this fellow in India that you should invite. His name is Padmasambhava. And so Trisong Detsen did. And Padmasambhava came, and in the 8th century, he established the Vajrayana in Tibet and defeated the forces that were obstructing the arrival of Buddhism, and with monks built the first monastery called Samye Ling, in the middle of Lhasa. So there are two kinds of transmission that came from Padmasambhava, what are called Kama and Terma. Kama means the word, and what the word is that these teachings were passed down word by word from one teacher to the disciple, to the teacher as it then became a teacher to that disciple, and so on. Now you know what happens when you tell a story and it's passed down from one person to the next. It changes over time. That's the problem with Kama, the word transmission of the teachings. They change over time. They get distorted. They lose maybe their impetus. Although Buddhism is constantly reviving the teachings. It's because Buddhism is so different than a theistic religion which believes in a dogma, an unchangeable written teaching, like the Bible, which can't change. Rather, in Buddhism, words, which are passed down from one person to the next, are meant to be appropriate to the people of that time, and they will change all the time, and they do. The second kind of transmission, especially of the Nyingmas, is what's called terma. Terma means revealed treasure. And Padmasambhava was the main producer of terma, although there were some others. And what it means is that he knew that the people of his time, 8th century Tibet, in the 700s, there were teachings that weren't appropriate for them, yet they were not ready. And so he hid them, knowing that they would be discovered hundreds of years hence, and even by whom. He knew by whom they would be discovered. These are called hidden treasures, and the people who find them are called tertons, which means treasure revealers. Trungpa Rinpoche was a terton. He discovered many, many terma, and there are two kinds of terma. One is an actual physical teaching, a physical object like a book, although it can also be a statue, whatever it might be. And these are hidden in any kind of place. It could be in the bed of a stream, in the rafters of a house, inside solid rock, which is magical. And then the terton finds the object, and as soon as they find it, the teachings from it flow into the terton, the treasure finder. The other kind of terma, Trungpa Rinpoche received both, are called mind terma. And these come like radio transmissions through the air over the centuries. The sadhana of Mahamudra, which we chant once a month, is a mind transmission that Trungpa Rinpoche received when he was in Tibet, in Bhutan, in 1968. So this book is an explanation of the terma discovered by Rigzen Jigme Lingpa, the hard essence of the vast expanse. That's what I've just mentioned. This is the Longchen Nyingtik, discovered by Rigzen Jigme Lingpa. And this book is an explanation of that text, which was a terma. Jigme Lingpa was a prodigy who became immensely learned with almost no study, arousing his wisdom mind in a series of long meditation retreats. And when we talk about long meditation retreats for this kind of people, we're talking about years, many years. Longchenpa spent, and Jigme Lingpa, each upwards of 20 years in meditation retreat, solitary. Jigme Lingpa received the hard essence of the great expanse in a series of visions of Longchenpa, who lived 1308 to 1363, 14th century, and Jigme Lingpa lived in the 1700s, 400 years later. He systematized the Nyingma teachings in his 7 treasures and other works Longchenpa did, especially the teachings of Dzogchen, the Great Perfection. Longchenpa was Jigme Lingpa's principal teacher, even though he lived centuries before. These 7 treasuries are legend. They are taught by many great Nyingma masters. Jigme Lingpa mastered Longchenpa's teachings and passed them on to several disciples, one of whom was Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu, who spent considerable time with Jigme Lingpa in central Tibet and then returned to Kham in the east. In Kham, Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu practiced what Jigme Lingpa had taught him, living on a remote mountainside in a mere depression in the ground. This is a story you will hear many times. Teachers seem to do this. No cave for shelter, wild plants for food, indifferent to comfort and convenience, letting go of all worldly considerations, concentrating on enlightenment. This is Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu. Disciples gathered around him in tents, one of whom was the young Patro Rinpoche, who received from him the teachings contained in this book no less than 14 times. Let that sink in. 14 times Patro Rinpoche received these teachings from Jigme Gyalwai Nyugu. Subsequently, Patro also studied with many other great lamas of the day, including, and this doesn't matter because we're not going to study him, the highly unconventional Do Khyentse Yeshe Dorje, who directly introduced Patro Rinpoche to the nature of mind. gave him pointing out instruction. Throughout his life, Patrul Rinpoche emulated the simplicity of his master, Jigme Gyalwai Nyugo. And although he was an incarnate Lama and could have lived a life of ease, he, quote, spent his life wandering from place to place, camping in the open in the guise of an ordinary beggar. If he was offered gold or silver, he would often just leave it lying on the ground, thinking that wealth was only a source of trouble, which he said. Even when he'd become a famous teacher, he would travel around unrecognized, living in the same simple, carefree manner. And then there's so many stories. Read the Enlightened Vagabond book. It's really hilarious. I mean, one time he encountered he became a famous teacher, and he encountered a Lama who taught him. This is taught Patrul Rinpoche this great work, The Words of My Perfect Teacher. And he let the Lama do it and just received it, even though he had written it. And there's so many stories. He was kind but tough to his students, treating beggars and kings in the same way. In all situations, his only interest was to benefit others. And he would always say whatever would be most useful, regardless of social niceties. We could aspire to this, to benefit others. His only interest was to benefit others. A section called The Stages of Practice. This book belongs to a category of literature known as written guides, Triyig, which emulate and supplement the oral instructions needed to elucidate a meditation in text. In this case, the text in question is the preliminary practice of the heart essence of the great expanse, the vast expanse. So this is a supplement to that. The heart essence of the vast expanse is a cycle of teachings that I have already said this, Longchenpa passed on to Jigme Lingpa, and is widely practiced in the Nyingmapa school, containing the complete Vajrayana path. And I happen to be studying personally with a Nyingma teacher. His name is Khenpo Nandro, and I would love to have you study with him. And in order to do it, he teaches only, at this point, all he teaches is Dzogchen, and mostly Longchenpa and subsidiary teachers related to Longchenpa. And it would require for you to become a student of Khenpo Nandro first that you complete Nandro. Those are the 4 practices which we're going to study here, and then that you meet him and ask for teachings, and no telling what will happen. But it's my aspiration that people that I know study with him. I've been studying with Khenpo Nandro now for 21 years. Okay. So we start with the beginning stage, which is with the preliminary practices, the Nundro. We're going to be going through this. These are the prostrations taking refuge, that's one of them. Vajrasattva practice, that's the second one. Mandala offering is the third. And the fourth is Guru Yoga, which is perhaps the most important of them all. So, followed by the main practice, which has 3 principal parts. The main practice, then once you've done your Nundro, the generation phase, which is called Keirim, the perfection phase, Dzogren, Dzog means perfection, Kei means stage, generation, and then finally the great perfection, the Dzogpa Chenpo. Again, this is the Nyingma scheme. Generation phase, you will be doing visualization and mantra recitation of deity, of a particular deity that you will work with. In the perfection phase, you rest in perfect awareness. And in the great perfection phase, there are practices that you do for them. The preliminary practices, this is the Nundro, have an outer and inner section, so our text is divided in 2. The first part, the ordinary or external preliminaries, deals with the freedoms and advantages offered by human life, which is so important to inspire us that we have this immense opportunity and we shouldn't let it go. The impermanence, which is death, the sufferings of samsara, which we hardly even notice, we become so inured to them. How karma, the principle of cause and effect, applies to all our actions, and we have to begin to understand this. The benefits of liberation and how to follow a spiritual teacher. All of this will be covered in the first part of these teachings. These are the fundamentals of Buddhism in general and can be practiced by anyone, Buddhist or not, it says. The second part, the inner preliminaries, for which the guidance of a qualified teacher is necessary. And these are the ones I just mentioned. Refuge, prostrations. Then comes one that I didn't mention, the development of the mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta, the desire to be of benefit, the sincere desire to be of benefit to all sentient beings. The attitude of unconditional love and compassion, which is the part of bodhicitta, seeking to bring all sentient beings to perfect freedom, which is the aspiration of bodhicitta. This is the basis of the Mahayana path and also absolutely essential to enter the Vajrayana. And this is followed by the practices to purify the effects of one's past negative actions and accumulate positive energy necessary to progress on the path. These practices use more fully the practices of visualization and mantra specific to the Vajrayana. And these are the ones I've mentioned: prostrations, refuge, Vajrasattva mantra, mandala, and finally Guru Yoga, uniting one's mind with the mind of the teacher. This is the very root of the Vajrayana, where the purity of the link between teacher and disciple is of paramount importance. And we'll be discussing this and your ability to connect with a Vajra master. Also included here in this book is the practice of pawa, or transference of consciousness. What happens is that when you die, if you haven't achieved enlightenment, you're going to go through the death bardos. And there are techniques to speed up your passage through these bardos into states of enlightenment of varying degrees, depending on your capacity. This is the practice of pawa, where you literally transfer your consciousness into, you might say, an enlightened consciousness. It could just be a realm where it's easier to tread the path to enlightenment. And these practices are mentioned here, and I'm thinking of trying to, well, we'll come to that. Next come the practices of the generation and perfection phases, culminating in the great perfection. And this journey is mapped with astonishing precision, with each stage having oral explanations and explanatory texts. The text does not go into the details of the rest of the path, but here is a brief overview. We've discussed the preliminary practices. And the first are the outer preliminaries, which are the 4 contemplations which turn the mind away from samsara. And we do this every day. Joyful to have such a human birth, difficult to find, free and well-favored, but death is real, and so forth. These are called the 4 outer preliminaries, these 4 contemplations. And they're just simple contemplations. The inner preliminaries are much, much more involved. And these are the 100,000 prostrations and taking refuge, raising bodhicitta, purification through the recitation of the Vajrasattva 100-syllable mantra 100,000 times, accumulation of merit through offerings of 100,000 mandalas, and then Guru Yoga, where you recite the Guru Yoga 1,000,000 times, the Guru Yoga mantra. So then that's the preliminary practice. Then there is the generation phase. One learns to develop an enlightened vision of the world by visualizing oneself as a Buddha and one's surrounding as a pure Buddha field while reciting the appropriate mantra. This is what you do after you've finished the preliminaries. You will visualize yourself as an enlightened being. It might be in the case of the Kagyus, and Trungpa Rinpoche taught this to his students, Vajrayogini, a 16-year-old in one form, 16-year-old naked, bright red. She is the representation of prajna, wisdom, and she is fierce. At first, this is artificial, he says, but the visualizations correspond, like a Vajrayogini, to the visionary experience of enlightened beings. Later in his life, Trungpa Rinpoche was seeing Vajrayogini all the time, including getting in and out of cars. He would open the door and motion her to get in ahead of him. By adopting these new habits of perception, one can weaken the ordinary habits of gross perception based on ignorance, avidya, and emotional tendencies, kleshas. So we're weakening those and put oneself with a more subtle level of experience. This is what the generation and completion phases are doing. These practices take the form of sadhanas, which are ritual texts, which are sometimes extraordinarily poetic, and you will come into contact with many sadhanas. The perfection phase, which we will also come to, says, this completes the process, taking it to a more interior level by working with the subtle energies of the body through mastery of the breath, physical postures, and other yogas. And then finally, in the Nyingma school, there is the great perfection. In Dzogchen, the nature of mind is introduced directly by the teacher. This is an immediate experiential recognition of the Buddha nature itself. And it's very precious, very indescribable, and very unpredictable. The subsequent practice consists essentially in getting used to that experience and developing it in an increasingly vast way. Here one acquires real or absolute wisdom, the direct experience of ultimate truth. There are so many stories of how different people experienced this transmission, the nature of mind. So for instance, there's the story of Naropa and Tilopa. And Naropa had a vision of Vajrayogini, actually, who appeared to him in the guise of an old hag bearing the 37 ugly marks, and asked him if he, the great Naropa, the great scholar, who was one of the great scholars of Nalanda University in the 11th century, and she asked him, do you understand the words? They're just the words, or do you understand what they mean? He said, well, I understand the words, and she was very happy. And then he said, yeah, and I understand their meaning too. She got furious, scared the hell out of him. Maybe not the hell, but scared him terribly, and told him, you need to find my teacher, Tilopa. The teacher, Tilopa. So he set off, he left Nalanda, the great abbot, and set off in search of Tilopa, followed Tilopa for 12 years, undergoing great hardships, expecting the teachings. Finally, Tilopa gave him the pointing out instructions, which we're talking about here, by taking off his sandal and slapping Naropa in the face. That's one way they could be transmitted. It's just totally unpredictable. There's another story of Patrul Rinpoche, is it Patrul Rinpoche? And his student, Lungtrul Rinpoche, who had been his attendant for something like 15 or 20 years. And at one point, Patrul Rinpoche is lying out under the stars, and Lungtrul Rinpoche is standing 15, 20 feet away, waiting to see if his master needs anything. And Patrul Rinpoche calls out to him. He said, Lungtrul, have you had pointing out instruction? You know, have you seen the nature of mind? And Lungtrul says, no, master. And Patrul Rinpoche says, Lungtrul, do you hear the dogs baying down by Dzogchen Monastery? And Lungtrul Rinpoche says, yes, master. And he says, and Lungtrul, do you see the stars in the sky? And Lungtrul Rinpoche says, yes, master. And Patrul Rinpoche says, that's it. And Uncle Rinpoche gets it. So you can get it by being hit in the face with a shoe or by something gentle like that. And endless stories, all of them different. So each practice that you go through builds on the previous and at the same time strips away layers of delusion, leaving an ever more denuded experience of reality. Especially Guru Yoga, which is the essence of all paths, and it's the fourth of those preliminary paths. Total openness and devotion to a realized teacher is the most sure and rapid way to progress. Patrul Rinpoche expressed this in the title to his book, Kunzang Lame Shelon. Kunzang means everywhere perfect. It's the abbreviated form of Kuntu Zangpo, Samantabhadra, the Buddha nature itself. Kunzang, the unchanging purity of mind, which is the fundamental nature of all beings. Normally, this nature is hidden, and it is the teacher who has realized it himself who would lead us to discover it within ourselves. So that's Kunzang. Lama literally means, it's the Tibetan for guru, but it literally means nothing higher. There is nothing higher. This is the guru, the teacher. As Patrul Rinpoche explains, the teacher is like the Buddha himself. So Patrul Rinpoche says that the Guru Yoga is in a sense superior to the generation and perfection phases because it directly opens the way to ultimate wisdom through the teacher's blessings. And now I'm going to turn this over to Michael, who's going to take the last. Oh no, sorry. Michael?
Yes.
There's more. Should I just keep going and we do your part next week? I'm worried that it's.
My part's fairly short, actually. So, yeah, why don't you go ahead?
So the origins of this translation. So the Tibetans have preserved all aspects of Indian Buddhism intact from the 8th century when it came to Tibet, but it continued to evolve. Buddhism was, I once sat with Trungpa Rinpoche and said to him, I get the impression that teachers sat around coming up with new ways to put it. And one of them might say to the others, hey, what do you think of this one? And they would say, yeah, that's pretty good. And he agreed, that's the way it happened. Buddhism continually evolved. It was a way of communicating to the people of the time the essence, which is utterly beyond words, ultimately. And so they say the Buddha spoke in 84,000 tongues, which means that he said what was necessary for his audience to hear, depending on who they were and where they were and what their inclinations were, in order for them to achieve enlightenment. The words are just pointers, ways to open us up. They are not writ in gold like the Bible. So the Buddhist teachings changed over the centuries as brilliant practitioners, teachers rephrased them. Changed all the time, still changing. This has given rise to an extraordinary range of philosophical, poetic, academic, and inspirational literature, as well as a distinctive and magnificent artistic and architectural heritage. So, for instance, wherever Buddhism has gone, different countries, it's found sort of a cultural translator. When it went to China, it used the language of Taoism. When it came to this country, Trungpa Rinpoche adopted the language of Western psychology. So we get phrases like ego. Ego is a Freudian term, and others, because he felt that it was the closest thing we had to translating Buddhism. And he says, but above all, the Tibetans used Buddhist teachings for their true purpose as a tool for transforming the human mind, which they did successfully, and many people achieved enlightenment. In each century, including the present one, and each generation has produced its share of spiritual giants. We've already talked about the 19th century with Patrul Rinpoche and Jamyang Khyentse Wimpa Rinpoche and Jamgon Kongtrul the Great and others. And the Rimé spirit, which these people developed, this is non-sectarianism, bringing together the different sects of Tibetan Buddhism, developed in the 19th century and is still alive today, and with the Dalai Lama and the late Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. It's called Rime. It says the Dalai, to give you an idea of how great Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche was as a teacher, the Dalai Lama regarded Dilgo Khyentse as his principal teacher in the Nyingma tradition and the teacher of Dzogchen. And he was also one of the main teachers of Chogyam Trungpa, whom he held in high regard. Dilgo Khyentse spent 20 years of his life in meditation retreats. This is such a common story. 20 years. And I have a friend that I just spoke to today who is going into a 3-year retreat. All right. Then there's more about Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, which you can read on all the things he did. And he considered Patrul Rinpoche to be the perfect example of a Dzogchen practitioner and encouraged and helped the translators of this book, which he considered to be the perfect guide for students embarking on the Buddhist path. Many teachers, great teachers, have taught this text, including not only Dilgo Khyentse, but Dujim Rinpoche, the late head of the Nyingma sect, and others. So I have to read the footnotes, and that's it. Michael, sorry to take up so much time, it was long.
It would help if I was unmuted. I'm just going to say a few things about the last section of the introduction, which is titled The Brief History of Tibetan Buddhism. Because really, John's already said quite a bit about what I think are the key points here. One is that there is a continuity of the teachings and of the practice from the Buddha through today. The second is there's a tremendous diversity in the teachings. And the last is that Buddhism is ever evolving or ever adapting. Just for instance, I attended recently a teaching with Punlap Rinpoche, where he talked about the importance of recognizing our minds, recognizing what's in our minds, recognizing where our mind is at. And he said, we're more likely to know where our iPhone is than where our mind is from moment to moment. And it's a perfect modern example of ignorance and the fact that so much of the time we have no idea what's in our mind. We have no idea where our mind is. And it's only when we sit in meditation that we realize how much confusion, how much distraction, how much absorption we actually experience from moment to moment. So it's a very modern way that really drives home. It certainly does in my experience, really drives home a point that the Buddha made 2,600 years ago. So again, there's a continuity to the teachings, there's a tremendous diversity in the teachings, and it's ever evolving, ever adapting. This section on the brief history really begins with a very, very brief summary of the life of the Buddha. And I'm not going to, I think most people are familiar with that. And if you're not, or even if you are, I really recommend the book Old Path, White Clouds that I've been reading, that was recommended to me when I was on the pilgrimage in India last fall. It's written by Thich Nhat Hanh, based on both Pali and also Chinese sources, and really describes the life of the Buddha. It's basically a biography, somewhat fictionalized, but overall pretty well historically based, or at least based on the sutras and based on the information that's available now about the life of the Buddha. And it really brings home how really remarkable that life was, not only in his search for enlightenment, but his ability to inspire and bring, John's holding up the copy of the book right now, his ability to bring so many people to the Dharma. And one of the things that struck me when I was on the pilgrimage, how Buddhism started with just one person, but in the course of his 40-some years of teaching, thousands of people, and then a continuity of teachings, as it says in the introduction, master to student, teacher to student, an unbroken chain that it's still alive today. Um, as John said, the teachings of the Buddha are often divided up into three categories of Hinayana, Mahayana, and the Vajrayana. But the key point is that the Buddha that they make in the introduction is the Buddha taught in different ways to different people. So there are a lot of different kind of teachings because he always presented what was most helpful to the people at that time. It's very similar to if you were to attend a formal teaching, there's a request for the teachings, which is something like, I may mangle this a little bit, but in accordance with the diverse capabilities and aspirations of sentient beings, I ask you to turn the wheel of Dharma of the greater, lesser, conventional vehicles. And it's really in that, the diverse aspirations and capabilities of beings. The idea is it does no good to teach something that people don't understand. And it does no good to teach something that people aren't interested in. So that a teacher has to adapt the teachings. This is, again, part of the ever adapting, ever evolving nature of Buddhism. And this is what the Buddha did throughout his lifetime, as well as countless teachers in the centuries and centuries since the time of the Buddha. I think I've shared before that sometimes the Buddhist teachings are divided up into what's termed provisional teachings and definitive teachings, or sometimes it's indicative teachings and definitive teachings. And the idea of provisional teaching is that it's a teaching that presents something in a way that people can understand. So that, for instance, a concept like no self, egolessness, would be very difficult for someone who's just being introduced to Buddhism to come to understand. But the idea of something like impermanence, that things are always changing, and through understanding something of impermanence, it becomes possible for someone to begin to develop some sense of what it means to have no self. Definitive teachings are teachings that go right to the heart of the matter, that I think the Longchen Nyingtik teachings that John talked about are definitely definitive teachings that get right at the heart of reality of our world, reality of the universe. But really what makes the teaching provisional or definitive isn't just the teaching itself. It's also how far we're willing to take it. If we really were to truly, as John said, bring into experience what impermanence means, if we were really truly to see in its fullest extent in our experience what interdependence means, then it would be a definitive teaching. So really the provisional and definitive is in part what the teacher chooses to present, but it's also how we're able to make use of it. And at all times, really that's what it comes down to, is what we're able to take into experience ourselves. So basically in terms of presenting the history, in the introduction, it talks first of all about the Nyingma, or old school, which is what Patrul Rinpoche's lineage was, that came to Tibet in the 8th century by brought to Tibet in the 8th century by Padma Sambhava, and then further developed by Longchenpa and Jigme Lingpa. And then the text mentions the three other main schools of Buddhism in Tibet: the Sakya, Gelugpa, and Kagyu, that it says were introduced after the 10th century. And again, the different schools of teachings are developed to meet the different needs of different cultures and people. And I like the quote, that they serve to split the light of the Buddha's teaching into a many-colored spectrum of traditions and lineages. And it's sad that that becomes sectarian, as it says in the text, but it also means that there are a lot of different teachings that might speak to us. And again, what it really comes down to is what speaks to each one of us. I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. It talks some about what was preserved in Tibet, that just because of the history of Buddhism in India, which that Buddhism was pretty well wiped out basically in India by Muslim invasions, as well as by the hostility of the Brahmin class. There are a lot of teachings in the Buddha that were, such as his willingness to accept untouchables, his willingness to ordain women, that were quite controversial even at the time. And again, if you go back and read Old Path, White Clouds, you get a sense of how radical the Buddha's teachings really were in the context of Indian society. Um, but what was preserved are the volumes of the Kanjur, which is the are over 100 volumes of teachings of the Buddha, and the Tanjur, which are commentaries on the Buddha's teaching. And the point here is that the purity and the complete scope of the teachings, Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, was preserved in Tibet. And part of this was because of Tibet's relative isolation from the rest of the world. So it's only in, the last 50 years or so where all these teachings have become available as a result of the diaspora from Tibet because of the Chinese communist invasion. So a lot of the Vajrayana teachings actually rely more on commentaries and dohas, and very short instructions that are presented, rather than the direct teachings of the Buddha. And I actually wanted to read something by Trungpa Rinpoche that addresses exactly that. Trungpa Rinpoche was also another great teacher who just recently passed. The custom in the Vajrayana tradition is to emphasize the study of the commentaries rather than the study of the Buddha's original teachings. Casually considering this, you would think or expect that we would emphasize the Buddha's teachings themselves in our study, because after all, is not the Buddha the most important teacher in the Buddhist tradition? Nevertheless, the tradition is to emphasize the commentaries of the great masters upon these teachings. This has been objected to historically by some scholars who have said, why study the commentaries rather than the Buddha's original statements? The reason is that the Buddha's original statements are extremely vast in extent and number. Also, they are not necessarily organized for easy study or reference. They are organized on the basis of the occasions on which these various statements were made. In addition, because these statements of the Buddha or teachings given by the Buddha were made on different occasions at the request of and for the needs of specific different individuals, they represent different styles of teaching. They are principally classed as belonging to either the indicative meaning or the definitive meaning. Simply by studying these original texts themselves, it is impossible for a beginner to determine what is an indicative statement or provisional statement and what's a definitive statement. On the other hand, the function of the Shastras or commentaries is to clearly distinguish between indicative and definitive statements of the Buddha, to collect similar teachings or those that need to be used together in one place for easy reference, to explain the hidden meanings or subtleties of the Buddha's teachings, and to summarize especially long treatments of topics that can be understood with a more brief explanation. In short, it is really through the commentaries that we approach the Buddha's teachings themselves. So that's the reason why, and I think that's the reason why, is particularly in the Vajrayana, we tend to study more the commentaries on the Buddha's teachings, the commentaries on other teachers, rather than the sutras directly themselves. However, if you read the sutras clearly, it's not hard to see how elements of the Vajrayana are present even from the beginning. And again, this was a teaching recently by Punlap Rinpoche, where he quoted directly from the Lalita Vistara Sutra, which is a sutra that basically, again, it's sort of a biographical about the Buddha. But in this case, the Buddha is talking directly right after his enlightenment. Profound and peaceful, free from complexity, uncompounded luminosity, I have found a nectar-like Dharma, or sometimes it's translated as, this is what I have found. Yet, if I were to teach it, no one would understand, so I shall remain silent here in the forest. This was the Buddha's first experience, that what he discovered was so profound and so vastly different from people's ordinary experience that he felt he couldn't teach it. As time went on, he realized that he could, and just actually looked for some of the people that he had practiced and studied with before. He felt that two of his previous masters would be able to understand what he'd experienced, but when he went back, he found that they had both died. And then he had 5 fellow students who had engaged with him in ascetic practices and felt that they would understand. When they first saw the Buddha coming, they felt that he had betrayed the ascetic teachings and were, sort of decided among themselves that they would not listened to him. But when he was actually there, his presence was so powerful that they ended up asking for teachings. And out of that, at Sarnath became the first turning of the wheel, the Buddha's teaching on the Four Noble Truths. So again, but to go back to the experience that he's describing in the sutra, profound and peaceful, free from complexity, uncompounded luminosity. When Punlap Rinpoche taught this, he said that actually these correspond to the four yogas of Mahamudra, that profound and peaceful correspond directly to one-pointedness, being able to rest directly in the nature of mind. That free from complexity talks about the utter simplicity, or utter simplicity of that experience. That luminosity connects directly with the yoga of one taste, and that uncompounded or unconditioned relates directly to the fourth yoga of non-meditation. So, and again, very similar to the experience of Rigpa in the Dzogchen teaching. So even in the early sutras, even the earliest Buddhist experience, he's really talking about what the Vajrayana experience is. It's in the introduction, it's said that the entire range of the Buddha's teaching can be summarized by the Four Noble Truths, which we ordinarily think of as a beginning Hinayana teaching, which it is. But at the same time, again, if we really bring the Four Noble Truths into our experience, really see what they mean to us and how they're a truth that we can actually see in our lives, that they're not external to us in any way, then it becomes entirely transformative. So the first noble truth, as I think everyone knows, is the truth of suffering, or as it says in the introduction, that conditioned existence is never free from suffering, that any happiness is temporary. And then the second noble, this alone is the basis for renunciation. This alone, if we really understood the truth of suffering, is the basis for renunciation. And it's also the basis for waking up and realizing that we're caught in a dream, we're caught in an illusion, we're caught in an endless struggle. And so that even the first noble truth has tremendous power to wake us up. The second noble truth is the truth of the origin of suffering. Now, interestingly, first, at least in my experience, the first time to encounter Buddhism, usually the truth of suffering is given in a single word. Sometimes you'll see that the truth of the origin of suffering is ignorance. Sometimes you'll see it described as desire. But in fact, it's all the Buddha's teaching that goes into the idea of karma, the skandhas, the nature of ego, the nature of ego clinging, all of that. In this introduction in particular, they really emphasize the power of karma, that any action that we might do, say, or even think gives rise to a result. This is what Trungpa Rinpoche used to call karmic momentum. And we see this when one thought follows another. And when we get really worked up about something, really angry, really passionate, really whatever we might be experiencing, really jealous, whatever it is, that even the thoughts have their own momentum, their own energy, you could say, that any action gives rise to a result. And this is what we say when karma is inescapable. And that just this basic truth of cause and effect, and that the driving force in particular of the negative emotions, passion, aggression, and ignorance, especially ignorance. And what they say is ignorance concerns not only a lack of wisdom in how we act, in other words, not being aware of what we're even doing, or as I said, Punlap Rinpoche said, more likely to know where our phone is than where our mind is at. So it's not only that, but the more basic ignorance, which is behind how we ordinarily perceive the world, how we ordinarily perceive the whole of existence, and constantly get caught up because of clinging to ego and the outer world as being solid and lasting. And that only when this leads to the third noble truth, that there's a possibility or the reality of cessation, that only when we cease to act through ignorance can the cycle be broken. This is cessation or awakening. And a real deep understanding of cessation, I think, is really coming to understand the true nature of our mind and seeing that all of the suffering, all of the confusion, all of the struggle really results from our misperceptions of ourselves and the world, our misunderstanding of ourselves and the world. And that when we come to realize our true nature as Rigpa or ordinary mind, that's cessation. And then finally, the truth of the path, that how we actually can achieve cessation, which basically comes down to the accumulation of merit or positive actions, as well as meditation practice and study, which cuts through the cognitive obscurations, our misunderstanding and the belief in ego and belief in the solidity of the world around us. It points out how, in the introduction, points out how the Buddha himself, and then in Tibet as well, that there were communities of practitioners who were monastic, as well as lay practitioners or householders. And this is true in the Buddha's time. It was true in Tibet. And that either path is valid. Either path is valid. Monastic, as it says in the introduction, monastic ordination is considered a useful support, but by no means the only way to progress in meditation. And then it ends with the last paragraphs about why the Vajrayana teachings are being taught now, that they're particularly powerful and flexible, and that according to Padmasambhava, that they're particularly powerful and effective for individuals living in a time when emotions are stronger than ever. And this seems to be such a time. That the Vajrayana is particularly flexible and adaptable to the sorts of situations in which modern people find themselves. So again, I think overall the point of this was not to give us a thorough history of Buddhism in Tibet, but to help us understand something about the continuity of the teachings from the time of the Buddha to today, and that this continuity is unbroken, to have some understanding of why there's so much diversity in the teachings, and to appreciate that all of them are, as it says, different refracted light to like a prism that reflects the light of the Buddha's teaching, and that because of the different capabilities and aspirations of beings, different teachings will appeal to different people at different times. So there's many different presentations, just as there was in the time of the Buddha. And then finally, appreciating the ever-adapting, ever-evolving nature of Buddhism. So I think with that, I will stop because it's just about time. But wanted to get that in before next week. I'm really excited myself to be reading this text. I have not read it before, but I've looked ahead enough to see that it really presents, you could say, an unvarnished truth. And it's as interesting to see I think it's interesting for me to see what I can immediately accept and what I really have to think about a little bit to say, because it's, as I say, it's unvarnished truth.
I hope you'll come to the group discussion tomorrow. And also, if anyone would like to speak to Michael or me about their path, I encourage you to do it. Yeah.
All right.
Just let us know. We'll set up a time. Is that okay?
Unfortunately, I have a schedule conflict, so I won't be for the discussion group tomorrow night, but I'll be with you in spirit.
Okay.
Anyway, I guess it's time to do the closing chants.
It is indeed.
So we'll close as always by reciting a prayer for peace. And dedicating the merit generated through our study and practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times, and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, John, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, everyone.
Michael.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Michael.
Thank you, John and Michael.
Thank
That
you.
was,
Michael, everyone.
thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah. Everyone, good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.